The buyer at the dock took one look at the last catch of the season and shook his head before the boat had even finished tying off. 1,000 oysters, maybe more, pulled from a bed. Everyone in the county had quietly agreed was finished. Undersized, misshapen, half of them barely clinging to life after 2 bad years of warm water and runoff. He offered nothing. Not a discount price, nothing at all. He told the old man standing on the deck that he'd be doing him a favor by not charging him to haul them off. The old man didn't argue. He didn't even look surprised. He just nodded, loaded every single oyster back onto his own boat instead of leaving them on the dock, and motored out past the breakwater to a stretch of shallow water nobody had worked in 15 years. And there, alone, as the light went orange over the sound, he began setting them back into the water by hand, one cluster at a time, exactly the way his father had taught him 60 years before. A younger waterman watching from another boat radioed over, half laughing, and asked him what in the world he thought he was doing, dumping $1,000 of worthless shellfish back into a dead reef. The old man didn't answer right away. He set another cluster down, watched the ripples settle, and said only that the reef wasn't dead, it was resting. And it had been waiting a long time for somebody to come back. And remember that if you believe some things given up for gone are only waiting for someone patient enough to look twice, stick around. This one's worth the whole story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We always want to know how far these stories travel. His name was Silas Meecham, 73 years old, and he had worked that same stretch of coastal water his entire life, the way his father had before him, and his father's father before that, 3 generations pulling a living from a bay that had once, by every account passed down through the family, been thick enough with oyster reef that a boat could barely cut a straight line through it. Silas remembered the tail end of those years as a boy, remembered the reefs breaking the surface at low tide like a second shoreline, remembered water so clear you could watch the oysters filtering it from 6 feet down. He had also lived through everything that came after. The dredging that scraped reef structure down to bare mud in the name of harvesting more, faster. The decades of runoff from farms and lawns and pinecloths upstream that fed the bay more nitrogen than it could handle, choking it with algae blooms that stole the oxygen right out of the water. Disease that swept through weakened populations with nothing left to resist it. By the time Silas was in his 50s, the bay's oyster harvest was a fraction of what his father had pulled from the same waters, and by the time he was nearing 70, most of the watermen who'd worked those flats alongside him had either quit or switched to crabbing, because oystering that bay had stopped being something a man could count on. Silas kept at it anyway, mostly out of stubbornness, pulling smaller and smaller harvests from beds that gave less every season. His wife had passed 4 years earlier. His son had moved 2 states north for work that didn't depend on a dying bay. What Silas had left was a boat that needed more repair than he could easily afford, a small waterside house that had been in the family for generations, and a battered logbook that his father had started keeping in the 1960s. A habit Silas had continued, without ever quite deciding to, recording water temperature, salinity, harvest counts, and notes on where the reef structure still held and where it had gone to bare mud. The rejected catch that started this story wasn't an accident. Silas had spent the better part of that final season deliberately pulling oysters from the worst parts of his lease. The stunted, misshapen survivors clinging to what little hard structure remained on a reef, the extension office had all but written off. He wasn't trying to sell them. He knew before he ever hauled them up that no buyer would take them. What he was actually doing, though he hadn't told anyone, not even his son, was testing something his father's oldest notebook had hinted at in a single underlined line from 1968. The ones that hold on through the worst years are the ones that rebuild everything after. There was one person left who might understand what his father had actually meant by that. A marine biologist named Dr. Renata Osei, who ran a small coastal research station 40 minutes up the shoreline and had spent nearly 2 decades studying oyster reef restoration up and down that stretch of coast. Silas had crossed paths with her exactly once, years earlier, when she'd come out to survey his lease for a county report nobody had acted on. He remembered her asking sharper questions than anyone else who'd come through with a clipboard. He drove out to her research station the week after the buyer turned him away, carrying his father's oldest notebook and a bucket of the rejected oysters, and asked her a question he felt almost foolish saying out loud. Could a dead reef ever come back on its own if you just put the survivors back where they came from? Renata didn't laugh, which he appreciated, but she didn't offer easy hope either. She told him that most attempts at natural reef restoration failed, that without addressing water quality and predation and substrate loss, simply returning oysters to degraded habitat usually just meant losing them a second time. But she looked at the misshapen survivors in his bucket for a long moment, turning one over in her hand, and said something that stuck with him. "These ones aren't misshapen because they're weak," she said. "They're misshapen because they fought the current their whole lives instead of growing easy. That's not damage." That might be exactly the genetics this bay needs. She agreed to help him test it, mostly out of scientific curiosity, warning him plainly that most restoration projects failed within the first 2 years and that he shouldn't expect a miracle. Silas's first attempt very nearly proved her right. He set the first batch of survivors onto open mud, the same way oystermen had worked that bay for generations, not understanding yet that oyster larvae need hard structure to attach to, something the decades of dredging had stripped away entirely. Within a season, most of what he'd set out had smothered in silt or been picked apart by predators with nothing to hide behind. Renata, when he told her, didn't say she'd warned him, though she had. She drove out with a truckload of clean, fossilized oyster shell, material she'd been stockpiling from restaurant partnerships up the coast specifically for projects like this, and showed him how to build proper reef-based structure before setting a single live oyster onto it. His second mistake nearly cost him the whole experiment. He rushed the second planting during a stretch of unusually warm water in early fall, not accounting for how vulnerable young spat were to a late-season disease outbreak that had been quietly building in the bay for years. He lost nearly half of what he'd planted within weeks. Renata didn't sugarcoat it. "Timing matters as much as the shell does," she told him. "You don't fight the water's calendar. You work inside it." Silas rebuilt his approach around patience after that, the kind that hadn't come easily to a man used to working alone on his own schedule. He started small, building shell base in a single sheltered cove first, using the fossilized shell Renata supplied and setting his hardiest survivors onto it in early spring when the water was cool and disease pressure was lowest. It was slow, unglamorous work, hauling shell by the bucket load from his boat, checking growth by hand every week, noting water clarity in his father's continued logbook. By early summer, that first small patch of reef was showing signs nobody expected that quickly. The oysters weren't just surviving, they were filtering. Silas began noticing the water in that cove clearing days after a rain, when the rest of the bay stayed cloudy for a week. He learned to read a healthy reef by the birds it drew, the way herons started working that cove more than any other stretch of shoreline, following bait fish that had started returning to structure they hadn't used in over a decade. Word moved through the Waterman community the way it always did, most of it unkind at first. A few of the younger crabbers joked that old Silas had lost his mind chasing dead shellfish nobody wanted. One asked his cousin, only half serious, if somebody ought to check on him, but not everyone dismissed it. An old waterman named Turk Holloway, who'd fished that bay alongside Silas's father decades before, started motoring past the cove just to look, standing off at a respectful distance in his skiff, nodding like he approved of something he couldn't quite explain yet. The turning point came during the worst algae bloom the bay had seen in nearly a decade, a summer event that choked oxygen out of most of the surrounding water and killed off shellfish beds up and down the coast. Silas's small restored patch, unlike nearly everything around it, kept filtering straight through it. The dense cluster of live oysters was pulling algae out of the water faster than the bloom could build in that particular cove, creating a small pocket of clearer, healthier water in the middle of a bay-wide crisis. 2 commercial beds 2 miles up the shoreline lost most of their stock that summer. Silas didn't lose a single cluster. That got attention in a way nothing else could have. By late summer, Silas had expanded his shell base to 3 coves, and Renata had begun formally documenting water quality improvements for a state grant report. Data that would eventually matter more than either of them realized yet. But the bay wasn't finished testing him. In early autumn, Silas noticed something wrong in the second cove, one he'd been especially proud of. Growth had slowed. Shells looked thin at the edges. When he pulled a cluster and cracked one open, the meat inside was pale and undersized instead of full and healthy. He brought a sample straight to Renata's lab, wrapped in a wet towel. She examined it under a scope for a long time before speaking. "Could be a few things," she said. "Could be a parasite working through the population. If it's that, we pull and destroy every affected cluster before it spreads to the healthy coves." Silas felt his stomach drop. Months of careful, patient work, threatened by something he hadn't even seen coming. They tested for the parasite using a field kit Renata kept at the station. It came back positive, but caught early enough that the damage was containable. "This is the part nobody tells you about restoration work," Renata said, snapping her kit shut. "It's not really about the oysters most days. It's about noticing trouble early enough to still do something about it." Silas pulled and destroyed the affected cluster that week, the way Renata had taught him, careful and methodical. Within a month, the healthy coves showed no sign of spread. It was a small crisis in the scope of everything he was building, but it taught him something that stuck harder than any success had. A recovering reef wasn't a finished project. It was something you had to keep watching, season after season, the same way you'd watch over anything alive and worth keeping. By the following spring, Silas had expanded to 5 coves, all rebuilt from oysters everyone else had written off as worthless. His reef restoration had begun drawing attention from the county extension office, and then from a regional environmental nonprofit that had been quietly funding oyster restoration projects up and down the coast for exactly this kind of promising early result. What Silas was actually building became clear only when local crabbers and fin fishermen started noticing something nobody expected. Their own catches in waters near his restored coves had started improving. The reef wasn't just filtering water. It was rebuilding habitat that fish and crabs depended on for shelter and food, the way healthy oyster reef always had, before decades of dredging stripped it away. Winter brought its own quiet test, one that didn't come with drama at all, just cold, patient waiting. Renata had warned him that reef survival through a hard winter depended on structure holding firm against ice and storm surge, not on anything he could actively do once the cold set in. So in November, Silas went through every cove one last time, checking that shell base was secure, reinforcing sections that looked thin, and marking his charts by hand the way his father always had. Then there was nothing to do but wait, motoring out anyway every few weeks, to check water clarity and listen. The way you listen for something you can't quite see, for whether the reef was still working beneath the surface. When the first warm days of spring finally arrived, and Silas pulled his first sample of the season, he found clusters exactly where he'd left them, having weathered a hard winter but alive, growing again in the lengthening light. Every cove had held. That same spring, once word had spread far enough, a chef from a well-regarded restaurant 2 counties up the coast drove out after hearing about the restoration project, from a supplier who'd tasted a small sample batch and been struck by the quality. Restaurants had been struggling for years to source oysters from that bay at all, the commercial beds having declined so badly that most had turned to shipping in stock from other regions entirely. The chef didn't want charity. He wanted consistency, a reliable local source that could actually supply him season after season. That single conversation forced Silas into a decision he hadn't expected to make so soon. Could he actually turn what had started as an experiment into something that fed people, that supported his own aging boat and gear, and that kept expanding the restored reef at the same time? Renata, when he asked her, told him plainly that a small, carefully managed, sustainable harvest could actually help a recovering reef rather than hurt it, as long as he never took more than the reef could regenerate. A principle her research station had seen work in other restoration sites up and down the coast. By the following year, Silas was running a modest, carefully limited harvest across his 5 restored coves. supplying 3 regional restaurants directly and reinvesting every dollar of profit into more fossilized shell for new reef base. Turk Holloway, who'd once just motored past to look, started showing up most weekends to help haul shell, something he later admitted gave him more purpose than he'd felt in years, since he'd quietly aged out of full-time waterman work. Renata's research station used Silas's 5 coves as the anchor site for a broader county restoration initiative, citing his careful, patient methodology in reports that eventually reached state environmental officials. The bay didn't change overnight. But something in the way people looked at a dying reef did. A collapsed oyster bed stopped being something you simply gave up on and started being something worth trying to save. A stubborn old waterman stopped being someone people quietly worried about and became someone a few of them started, cautiously, to admire. What Silas had built wasn't flashy, it wasn't a business empire or an overnight transformation. It was a small, patient system of restored reef, cleaner water, and a bay slowly remembering what it used to be able to support. Proof that most of what everyone else had written off as finished just needed someone willing to look closer and ask whether resting was really the same thing as dead. He still keeps his father's logbook, filled now with pages of his own handwriting layered over decades of his father's. And every spring, when he motors out past the breakwater and watches herons working the shallows over reef that wasn't there 10 years earlier, a few more people in that county remember exactly why they used to shake their heads at him, and exactly why they don't anymore. If you've ever worked a piece of water, or land, or anything else nobody else believed in anymore, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more stories about ordinary people building something extraordinary out of what everyone else gave up on.